Thank you, everyone. We'll begin right away. Thanks for being here, Akshay. And do we have a copy of your book here? No. So Akshay has written this absolutely beautiful, intricately researched, stunning work, a biography of Sachidanand Hiranand Vatsyayan, better known as Agyey. And everybody, I think, has commented on how big the book is and how much research it must have taken. So before we begin, tell me, how long did it take you to write the book and how much research did you have to do?
Book took around 5 years. I always, everything put together, the research, the writing and the publication. Although it got delayed because of few reasons, COVID and publishing house getting closed. But yeah, the 2 books that I've done, they are like undergrad course. I call them doing undergrad course, 4 years plus 1, basically. So it takes, it's almost undergrad course that I do, yeah.
Where all did your research take you? I believe you traveled everywhere.
Yeah, my research took me to all kinds of places, from the dusty archives in Delhi, archives a little bit in Allahabad, and also to to many places in US. Chicago, Stanford, New York. These 3 places that I kind of went to, looking for these gaps in Agyey's narrative, because Agyey is the most divisive.
So you can see the book and how big it is, and it's very impressive. Yeah, sorry, do continue.
Yeah. So, because with Agyey's life, if you talk to anyone in the Hindi world, and even in the non-Hindi world, people know of him, and you will realize there are many, many myths about Agyey. Many myths about Agyey, be it about from his childhood to his college years, to his revolutionary years, and later on, people saying that he was a CIA agent, and of course his personal life. His personal life is, you hear all kinds of stories. And he was probably the only Hindi writer who was consistently on the wrong side of the left, and left always attacked him. And he remained, I call him the first free thinker of the Hindi world. He was not politically aligned, although he was a very close friend of M.N. Roy, and later on socialists like little bit Lohia and JP to a large extent, but he remained a free thinker. And there are many loopholes, gaps, which took me a long time to fill, yeah.
So Agyey was a short story writer, a poet, a novelist, a journalist. So he was many things rolled into one. And was that one of the reasons that attracted you to do a book on him? Because why Agyey? There are so many colossal figures in Hindi literature.
Why Agyey? Because, it's a very interesting question. Everyone asks me. Because if you see Agyey, in fact, of his generation of Hindi writers, and even subsequent generation of Hindi writers, there are very few people who had cosmopolitan upbringing like Agyey had. Agyey was born in an open field in Kusinagar, near Gorakhpur. When his father was a very big archaeologist and epigraphist. And father's job took him all parts of India, including South, in Utkamand, and that's how he lands in Madras Christian College. So he had a very different kind of upbringing. He essentially came from a very English-speaking world. He doesn't belong to the Hindi world at all. He is not your Hindi heartland man. He's a Punjabi by birth. And he says it also, that in the Hindi world, people didn't take me seriously for long, and they always were, I kept getting extra criticism from the Hindi establishment. And if you look at his personal life again, how many Hindi writers or writers across languages we know who led such fascinating life? He, in late 20s, he becomes a revolutionary. He's a bomb maker. He's called a scientist among revolutionaries. Spends 4 years in jail. Later on, in the Second World War, the revolutionaries of the 1930s joins British Army, and for which left never kind of spared him. They always said, well, he was a British agent. How do you explain a revolutionary of the 1920s becoming a British soldier in the early 40s? And later in 1950, when CIA was setting up Congress for Cultural Freedom all over the world, he is a key organizer of the first event in Bombay. So he led these multiple lives, and his literary output, 1941, when Sekhar Ek Jivni comes, it completely revolutionizes Hindi world. It's first modernist novel in many ways. Although Agyey kept saying that Janendra Sunita, or I think some other novel was the first modernist novel. Same with poetry. 1944, Tar Saptak comes and completely changes. So from new kind of stories, Nai Kavita, then Nai Kahani, everything, he's at the forefront of everything. And to top it all, his personal life, his love life was very fascinating. So it had everything that a biographer would look for.
So let's visit some of those controversies one by one. So he joined the revolutionary movement, and he was known as scientist, and he believed that they made bombs and so on. He went to jail for 4 years. But then Agyey does an about turn. He gives a written submission saying, "Maine to kuch nahi kiya tha. I didn't participate in any revolutionary activity," and he quickly gets out of jail. So that is a little hard to stomach, isn't it?
Yeah. In fact, Agyey's life, if you see, it's full of such contradictions. It's full of contradictions. Not only here, a man who says that he's so much. He wrote all his novels, at least Sekhar, and many of his poems. If you look at his private papers, many of them were first written in English. Sekhar, a better part of Sekhar was first written in English in jail. Same man has this contradiction that. By 50s, he became a big votary of that everyone should write in their mother tongue. But at the same time, he's the one who's most keen to get translated in English. So Agyey's life, yes, and that episode, I had to put it because, a whole lot of planning went into, if you look at the papers, he wants to get out of jail because he's desperate. So we can see it as a desperation. He's in his early 20s, his father is very worried, and so this was a ploy. But yes, it brings out the contradiction of Agyey, like many other, like on English, on Hindi. So Agyey's life is also full of contradiction, and it's a big one, this contradiction, yeah.
And now you talked about how he joined the British Army in the 40s because he thought fascism was a bigger threat than the freedom movement. However, let's look at it in context. That's the time when the Quit India movement is raging in India. The whole nation is convulsed in the fight for freedom. British repression is very savage. In such an atmosphere, to suddenly decide, now I'm going to join the British Army. There's something that doesn't seem to add up here.
This is again Agyey. This is a typical Agyey. As one of his poems says, Bheed ka mat ho data reh, kintu digvid panth ke samuday se tu akela mat choot. So he has this whole thing of doing things in a very different way. And he's very, very consumed by the idea that fascism is a bigger enemy than Britishers. And we should fight it out. And that time he's in love with this absolutely very, very exceptionally gifted woman, Kripa Sen, who's telling him, what will you do in army? And he has this whole argument about it. So partly, and he's also saying that, look, other writers are only talking about not joining, kind of fighting Britishers. And that's not enough. Or even those who are talking about fighting fascism are not doing enough. A writer's job is to go out also so that he means what he says. But again, another contradiction comes in 1970s. He gives a long interview to for Duke University Archives, and there he says it's not a writer's job to bring revolution. So another contradiction. But yes, Agyey had this major thing that I will do things differently. And he says also in that interview to the Duke University that, you know, I think differently. I'm very un-Indian. As Sripat Rai, his publisher, used to say that there are only two Indians misborn in India, you and Jawaharlal Nehru. You know, so there was this whole thing about... so Agyey always loved to do things differently and get very, very passionate about it, consumed by the idea, and he didn't care much. And then, therefore, he writes Nadi Ke Dweep. Nadi Ke Dweep is basically an explanation of why he did what he did during the Second World War. Yeah.
So we'll come to his love life in a minute because it's too interesting to skip. But you mentioned the Congress for Cultural Freedom when he opened the Indian chapter in 1951, and it later turned out that this was financed by the CIA. So when you were doing your research, do you think that he or anyone at that time, and even JP was a part of this Congress, did anybody have any inkling that it could be CIA money behind this? Or did they think it was just American money? Or what did they think where the money was coming from?
See, to be fair to them, they were not aware it is CIA money. And the web was so different that it was very difficult to figure out. Because someone was sending money, there was a parent Congress for Cultural Freedom in Paris, they were sending money for organizing this event in Bombay. And Agyey's connection with CCF was very short-lived because of some controversy which happened, and he had to leave formally. He left. He was thrown out, rather, by Meenu Masani and others. But he kept the individual connection with some of these people, like people in Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. He kept these connections and he used it, and that became he used it for his teaching abroad, fellowships abroad, in which his later wife also helped a lot. So yeah, they were not aware that time. And Agyey, and by, you know, the whole controversy, the stories came only in the late 60s, when New York Times started saying that CIA funded and they proved it. So that's when it came to light. Yeah.
Was it part of this whole this whole thing, for instance, Encounter magazine, which was edited by Stephen Spender?
Yes.
It turned out was also financed by the CIA.
Encounter,
right?
Quest in India, Quest, which was published from Bombay, edited by Nissim Ezekiel. And there was another journal from the Arab world. So there was another one in Africa. So they had all those continents and big countries mapped. Wherever they felt that the influence of communism is rising, they were funding all this. And Quest was kind of openly funded by them.
This was sort of cultural weight.
Yeah, it's a cultural weight behind
communism. Yeah. You mentioned how Agyey was different. So here's a man who also wrote in English, who traveled abroad extensively, in fact, worked very hard to make sure that he traveled. You know, wrote to the Rockefeller Foundation and got grants to finance his travels. He taught in an American university. He lived in a very posh part of Delhi in his later life. Do you think that all this made him somewhat of an outsider? Not just the fact that he was Punjabi, but all this also made him an outsider and seen as something of an elitist person. Because most Hindi writers, as you said, were from the hinterland and, you know, they had not done these things.
Yeah, that contributed to his he being seen differently and being alienating him. Because I must have interviewed 60 people, authors, mostly those who knew him. And everyone had the running thing was that with Agyey, he would stand out in the crowd. He was a man who spoke very little in public. And there was this whole air about him, which in many cases people thought was arrogance or anything, but yeah, he stood out. And which was partly his it was deliberate also, that he stood out. He dressed differently, he talked differently. Unlike the Hindi authors of his generation, in fact, in many ways his love life is fairly well known, you know. So he was doing everything in a way. And so many things, his writings, his personal life, the way he stood out differently, he dressed differently. In fact, a number of people you'd met who can only talk about his clothes, you know, the way, and he designed his own clothes, and he was many things. He was a great cook. he was a great carpenter, he was a great gardener, you know, so he had these multiple things which became a kind of intimidated the larger Hindi world as well as people who didn't know him. In fact, Krishna Baldev Baid wrote a long piece after his death that ye mukhota pehne aadmi kaun hai. It's a long piece he wrote in Hans, no, not Samalochana or somewhere. And then he says once he started talking to him, he'll realize he's a very different man. Yeah.
Did he cultivate a persona, you think?
Partly yes. It worked for him because, you know, that whole mystique around Agyey. Even now, Hindi world is kind of, if you ask me, is virtually divided in the middle of those who love him, those who don't love him. And those who love him can't hear anything bad things about him. Those who hate him think he was an evil in Hindi and all that, yeah.
So you talked about his love life, which was very open and which was a very, what shall I say, colorful. You have also in your book, Akshay unearthed his romance with Kripa Sen that not too many people know about. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Kripa Sen came from a very different, unlike all the women in his life, Kripa Sen was an equal match for him. In the sense, all the other women were miserable. Although Kripa also ended up being miserable in the relationship, because women in general with Agyey ended up miserable, and they were all very accomplished women in their own right. But yeah, Kripa, he met her as part of, he used to do a lot of this All India radio thing in Lucknow and other places. They met just before the Second World War, just before he was joining the British Army. And she was completely swept by Agyey. And although she had many suitors like Krishan Chandar, the great Urdu writer, and many others. And she came from a very elite family. She studied in England in the 1920s, and she was part of the elite. Unlike other lovers of Agyey, she was kind of, and she was madly in love with him.
How did they meet?
They met at an All India Radio. That's how they met. And then slowly she was coming out of a bad marriage. He was coming out of a bad marriage, and they just met. And so much so that she even got pregnant with his child, which was completely unknown. And Agyey, in a completely heartless manner, allowed her to abort the child and later blamed her also for that. So, and she was a kind of, her love letters would be taught in literature classes of how someone can write such beautiful love letters. And she could write 4 love letters in a day, all 4 different from each other. Not at all repetitive. Yeah? No, to same man.
All the letters were to Agyey.
To Agyey, and same man. And she was a complete, and she called herself gypsy. She was ahead of her times. But with Agyey, what happens that despite all that she had a mind of her own, like all women had mind of their own, all his lovers and wives, but she was cut from a different cloth altogether. But like all of them, she also ended up miserable, found herself somewhere in Europe. Nobody knows about Agyey. I spent better 6 months trying to figure out what happened to Kripa Sen. I couldn't find anything. Yeah.
How did the affair end?
Affair ended when he refused to marry. After, I think the affair ended the moment she aborted the child. She aborted, and that was the end of the relationship. And there was this doctor in army who helped her get over this whole mental trauma. She married him. And still she was so much in love with Agyey that ahead of her time, very few women or men can do this. They have kind of that guts. She's marrying someone and she's writing to Agyey that, look, we can keep our affair going. Why don't you befriend my husband, though you will have easy access to my house, and we can carry on with our affair. And Agyey actually writes to her husband, and Agyey husband writes back saying that, look, I'm aware of what was going on between you and Kripa, so it's not a good idea that you visit my house. So more or less the affair ended there. Although in Europe when he goes, Raja Rao tells him she's somewhere in Europe, they meet. They meet in Europe somewhere. After that, she just vanished from the face of this earth. Yeah.
So all these different relationships Agyey had with various women in his life, and very accomplished women and very intelligent, bright, talented women. And you said most of them were miserable in the relationship. So what was it? Were they just so much in love with him that they stayed with him despite being unhappy? What did you think it was?
No, only last
when you were
week,
doing your research?
yeah, only last week I was talking to a lady who is in her early 70s and she met him when she was in her 30s. And I asked her this question. I asked her when I was writing the book that what was it about him? He came with a reputation. By then he had two marriages gone haywire, many relationships didn't work. Still, why were women attracted to him? And women, like, his last partner was 33 years younger to him. What was it about him? And she said, look, I don't know, but maybe for the time he was with you, he made you, every woman wanted to be treated the way Agyey treated women. Maybe, I don't know. I remember asking Sudhir Kakkar, he said, listen, you are writing a biography, don't psychoanalyze her. Just leave it to the readers. And he was right. It's beyond me. I asked many women. I remember someone who is in her early 40s. She met him, Agyey was visiting Calcutta and he had gone to her grandparents' house. And as a 9-year-old, she saw him and she said that there was something about him that I still remember him. 9-year-old girl. So there was something. I don't know what. I have asked women who kind of spend time with him. Some of them are very, and there's another professor who retired from Delhi University. She told me the same story. I asked her, why were you in love with him? She said, I don't know why I was in love, but there was something about his presence. Another woman says, I went to see him, 10:30, he says, come have a cup of coffee with me. And she had to go somewhere. He said, by the time I realized, it was 2:30. So there was something. There must have been.
So Agyey's love for his cousin sister is well known. Was that his true love, you think?
Yes, in many ways, yeah. And after that, some bit Kripa Sen. Because, he had many affairs. It's only Kripa who immortalizes in Nadi Ke Dweep. And also this whole conundrum of, Kapila coming into his life around that time, affair with Kripa. But Indumati, his first cousin, his Bua's daughter, who lived with him throughout, she accompanies him from, she was coming out of a bad marriage, her marriage was over, and she's traveling throughout from Agra to Meerut to Calcutta to all these places. They're constantly. Later, she takes up a job in Meerut, where she's teaching in a school, Raghunath High School. Then she goes to some other place. Later, she's even part of the post 47. She's part of some partition work. She lands in Dhaka. She makes brief appearances here and there, but she's again a very miserable lady. Again, she later says that don't even write to me. Just don't keep me informed about you. See, again, the family doesn't want to talk about her. And in many ways, yeah, he was true. He immortalizes her in Sekhar. Yeah. Sekhar, that whole character of Sasi is Indumati.
When you were writing the book, Akshay, were you at all squeamish about bringing out aspects of his personal life? And you've also been very unsparing when you've talked about other aspects of his life. Whereas in India, I think we are more used to a sort of reverential tone towards the subject. Just tell us a little bit about that process.
No, I'm not at all squeamish. I love biographies which have everything. A biographer cannot rescue someone's reputation. I can't rescue someone's reputation. The best thing is that you just tell the story of Agyey the way it is. All I'm trying to do is what it does at the end of the day. It brings the humanness of Agyey, this larger than life image of Agyey, this many stories. You find that at the end of he is like any other man. He's petty, he's self-centered, he's extractive in relationships, and yet he writes great poetry. So this whole, someone asked me the other day, in fact, some book talk, that why are you judging him? I said, well, I'm not judging him. It's not my job to judge. I'm not even, although I love this cancel culture with the new generation is doing, I'm not even part of the cancel culture. But point is that as a reader, what do? Should I stop reading T.S. Eliot? There is this whole James, this British writer, was having lunch with T.S. Eliot, the writer and his wife, and T.S. Eliot was laughing away at lunch, and his wife tells him that I will never have lunch with T.S. Eliot. Look, his wife is in mental asylum and he's happy. He says, look, you have to decide whether you want to read him, not read him. If we get into the life, what do we do with Picasso? Or many, many others. These writers, poets, painters, they're all very different people. But as a biographer, it's not my job to brush anything under the carpet. I just don't do it. And some of the best biographies I have written, I have read are, which are no holds barred. You know, people who love Agyey still love him. You know?
You said in an interview that you're something of a biography junkie.
Yeah,
Do you read a lot of biographies?
Yeah, I read all kinds of biographies from Pol Pot to Rasputin to everyone, you know. So, and then say someone like Rasputin, someone writes, and not one, there are two big biographies of Rasputin. Or Coco Chanel. Coco Chanel, I'm now a Coco Chanel junkie. There are 7 biographies of Coco Chanel. And each has a very different story about Coco Chanel. And see, so much has gone in her life.
Controversial
roles, everything, and she's more than a fashion icon, which she became. And there was so much darkness in the life. So, and people are bringing out everything. Or for that matter, the new biography series of Stalin, which Kotkin is doing in, I think, Stanford. The 2 volumes have come. 3rd one is still coming. Every 6 months, there is a new biography of Hitler, which is new material. Yeah, biography, I read all kinds, I just keep buying, I keep reading biographies, yeah.
So you mentioned a little earlier that it's not the job of the biographer, as Sudhir Kakkar told you, to try and psychoanalyze your subject because maybe it's a vain and futile endeavor. However, when you read Shekhar Ek Jeevni or Nadi Ke Dweep, as you mentioned, both of which are largely autobiographical, when you read Shekhar Ek Jeevni, you can't but be struck by the relationship of Shekhar with his parents, which was very difficult, especially with his mother, who didn't seem to give him much love and was extremely violent towards her child. So it seems to me that when you read about the childhood of Shekhar and Shekhar Ek Jeevni, it's a very damaged child and young man you're reading about.
Yeah, Agyey had a very almost non-existent relationship with his mother. And he writes in the diary that, you know, what do you expect of a woman to do with 10 children, all of the almost same age? And the woman has to take care of the cooking, running the house, and troubling. So see, he writes that he used to put burning coal in their mouth, which is kind of an atrocious thing to do. No one should do it. But so that kind of, mother is completely absent in his narrative, his stories. Very rarely he talks about mother, hardly. In fact, when his mother dies, he writes a letter to Janendra, and it's in the 3rd para, and Janendra freaks out that, my God, your mother died, and you're in a matter-of-fact manner, you're saying mother died. So he's very close to his father, and father has great ambitions about his son, and the rest of the family too. He was his father's favorite child, by all account. But yeah, mother is non-existent. Maybe, someone said that maybe that's the reason he behaved with women that he did. I don't know. I have no way to understand these things. Could be, maybe not. But yeah, mother was completely absent in his life.
So this might be a slightly unfair question, Akshay, but as I had mentioned at the beginning of the interview, Agyey was a novelist, a short story writer, a journalist, a poet. Which role do you think he truly shone in? Or do you think all of them, he brought a lot of luster to each role that he played?
I will say early short stories, poetry to a large extent, except last few collections, and journalism. His journalism very rarely gets talked about, but if you see his journalism, and he has this, first job as a journalist is editing this paper weekly from Agra called Sainik. He comes, he introduces someone like M.N. Roy to the readers. He requests M.N. Roy to write, and M.N. Roy writes, and it gets translated. He takes, and then various other, he's doing journalism. He's also very critical of, Sainik was a pro-Congress paper, like in the pre-47 period, most of them were. And, but he's still critical of the Congress. He says, why joining the government of the 37 elections can be a bad idea. Then he goes to Vishal Bharat, he brings new ideas, he takes M.N. Roy there. You find a lot on art, culture. You see very young Lohia, Ram Manohar Lohia writing in Vishal Bharat when he's editing Vishal Bharat. And he's probably the only Hindi writer. After that, nobody has done it, or before him also no one. This larger thing of building a community of writers, and he does that. Then he starts Pratik from Allahabad. It's the first time that a commune style of living starts in one house. And some of the leading lights were living in that house. Nemi Chand Jain, Bharat Bhushan Agarwal, Sripat Rai, Agyey himself. And and when he comes to, by the time he comes to Din, and he has this very short-lived life of a journalist. Every publication he starts or works for closes very quickly. Dinman is something he starts, which is the longest job he held anywhere. And look at Dinman. Dinman was one of the best political weekly. I mean, no Hindi or English publication can come close to what Dinman was. And Dinman, he introduced so many new elements, so many new things. And his reporters of Bihar, he's traveling with Phanishwarnath Renu and doing daily reporters and giving all the bylines to Phanishwarnath Renu, and which came as a separate book, Rinjal, Dhanjal. And they are remarkable reporters. Even when he comes to Navbharat Times, which is the last job, which when Janata Party came to power, Times of India in its usual way gave it to him because they thought he's close to power, and that job he couldn't keep for long. Again, he changes, within no time he changes the paper. So his role as a journalist is slightly kind of doesn't get talked about, but he played a great, even Vak, he starts, which is a unique. We see later on, we see Granta and many things. In many ways, it's an early stage of that. It's a South Asian writing. And look at the kind of writers he introduces. You have A.K. Ramanujan writing there, who turns out to be a great Indian poet. Nirmal Verma's early stories, Raghbir Sahai, everyone is working there. All kinds of people are working. So he has great ideas, great journalists. But somehow he could never hold to job, and it was unfortunate. Many of the publications died. Yeah.
So this inability to hold a job, this certain restlessness, this certain attention deficit, he also seemed to fall out with his mentors quite a lot. Why did that happen? Tell us a little bit.
That's typical Agyey. Again, Agyey, if you see his relationship in the early, when he's in jail, he's very close to Janendra. Later, Banarsi Das Chaturvedi, everyone is falling out with. Later on, this whole new gang of writers, Dharmbir Bharti, Bidyan Sahi, all these people are very close to him. Later, then Raghbir Sahai, Sarveshwar Dayal Saxena. By his late 60s, he becomes a prophet. And like all prophets, he surrounds himself with mediocre people. Super mediocre people who will not question him. Even people like Raghbir Sahai was very close to him, and Sarveshwar Dayal, they pushed themselves to the margin deliberately because they knew it's not going to work. And someone like Malayaj in his diary writes in great detail about the kind of people he is surrounded with. Some of the writers who are still alive, so I don't want to name them, their constant endeavor was that how Agyey can help them get published. And they're writing wretched novels, poetry, short stories, and they're telling Agyey, please get me published. And Agyey loved it. He's the prophet by then. And he also surrounds himself politically with people, all kinds of people, and that takes him to this Indianness, Hinduness thing in the 70s.
So just one or two questions, and I'll throw it open to the audience. There was also this very infamous, created, manufactured, real, I don't know, sort of rivalry with Mukti Bodh as to who is the better poet. Tell us about that.
See, he and Mukti Bodh got along very well. It's one of those Hindi literature's thing which I never understood. They were very cordial to each other. In fact, Mukti Bodh gets published in Taj Saptak, and he goes out of the way to help. And he's in fact, many times Mukti Bodh unburdens himself before Agyey. Mukti Bodh's fame comes after his death. And there was this whole concerted move to build Mukti Bodh against Agyey.
As a superior poet.
As a superior poet. And it goes to the absurd length, as Alochana magazine once did a graphic story saying that in whose poems you find beauty more, in whose poems you want love more. That kind of, it's a pie chart the comparison between Agyey and Mukti Bodh. And it was never there. In fact, by Agyey you find after Mukti Bodh's death, because actually he's getting irritated constantly by all this. In the Duke University archive interview, he says that, well, Mukti Bodh, I thought was, and which is much later after Mukti Bodh's death, and he says, well, I had great regard for him, but I thought he was just too political. Maybe he was getting too polemical. So that's a poet's criticism of a fellow poet. It was nothing personal. In fact, if you go to Mukti Bodh's house, I didn't go, Mukti Bodh's son's house, one of the pictures hanging on the wall is still of Agyey. Yeah.
So the last question, his last years, when he seems to have sort of changed a little, what happened to him?
Well, as I said, he became a prophet and surrounded himself with all kinds of people.
But he also seemed to be in search of some sort of
yes, and
Indianness.
that starts with this almost, I will not call it fanatic, but it's like borderline chauvinism about Hindi, or the stroke mother tongue. He goes somewhere in the 60s in Kerala or 70s and he says, oh, I shouldn't be speaking to this crowd in English. Wish I was speaking to you in Hindi and you would have understood. Or you would be speaking in Malayalam and I understand Malayalam. Fair enough. And he says that, everyone should write in their mother tongue. Then someone, I remember this Duke University professor told him, what about Vladimir Nabokov? He said, don't give me an exception. Exception only proves my rule, my theory that everyone should write in mother tongue. So if you see, his chauvinism starts with that. By his mid-70s, around the time he gets Gyanpith and all, it becomes very hard. Now he's in search of this Indianness. So, pehle Hindi, फिर Indianness stroke Hinduness. And you find a complete absence of rituals, gods, goddesses, the way it's understood by certain people in Agyey's work in the early years. Now he has become ritualistic also. If he wants to plant a sapling somewhere in Somnath, he has to plant it there. He does some rituals with Ila Dalmia in a temple in Rajasthan. There's some Havan takes place, which was not done by him, but by another fellow writer who was again part of his group, Havan in Bikaner. So all those things are happening. He attends one RSS function. He attends BJP's inaugural function in 1980, Advani calls him. And later on, he even attends some of this one RSS function. And his is constant search. And like it happens after death, RSS appropriates him. But at the same time, one should not forget to say, one of the most scathing attack on RSS, one of the most scathing attack on Hindutva was done by any other writer, it was Agyey. If you read Dhanman, he writes, na Rashtriya hai, na Swang hai, na Sangh hai, about RSS. Then he and Hindutva ki paribhasha, he says, ki, where will it end? Are you trying to get everyone from Afghanistan to India? He's just scathing. This is 60s, late 60s. But yeah, 70s something happened. So then he attacks secularism. If you see his attack on secularism, many of this you will find critique of Ashish Nandi almost similar. So well, I can take that. But this whole ritualistic thing that he gets into is is kind of a matter of concern. And then he says that people don't understand Indianness. I'm looking for Indianness. Yeah.
On a lighter note, he also says that Niraj Chaudhary and Mulk Raj Anand can't write. Huh?
He doesn't like Indian writers in English. Mulk Raj Anand was his friend. Niraj Chaudhary says can't write. Of course, Khuswant Singh and many others. He's very dismissive of Indian writers in English in general. Yeah.
Was there any Indian writer he admired, not in English, but in the mother tongue?
Well, he admired some writers. For instance, he was a big fan of Dharambir Bharti till they fell out with each other. Like Agyey's life, he fell out with everyone. Dharambir Bharti, they had a very bad fallout. So much so that his wife had to intervene and some kind of relationship was established. But
was Premchand the kind of mentor to him for a
yes,
short while?
In fact, if you see Premchand's last interview that Premchand ever gave, which was first published in Bisal Bharat, even before Agyey joined Bisal Bharat, he was asked who are the new writers one should keep an eye on. And Premchand names Agyey. And Agyey name itself was given to him by Premchand. So yeah, Premchand, and they communicated also.
So Premchand was prophetic in a way.
He was prophetic in a way.
Thanks, Akshay. We'll take questions now. We don't have that much time, but we'll take some questions. Yes, gentleman there. Please keep your questions short and no long comment, please, or I'll interrupt you.
Yeah, okay. So, while talking about relationship between Muktibodh and Agyey, you said that Agyey mentioned that Muktibodh was too political. How much political do you find Agyey's writing? Means, what was his political inclination then?
He, as I said earlier, he was probably the first free thinker of Hindi literature. But Agyey's writing went through phases. If you look at the early writings, it's very political. He writes a big poem. He's a fanboy of Nehru. But after 20 years, he writes a poem in '67 called Bees Baras Baad, which is one of the best poems on what went wrong with Indian independence. So he's very political without being aligned to one ideology or the other. And again, like one of the contradictions of Agyey is the man who himself says that a writer should join in action, and this he does in 40s when he joins army. By 70s, he says it's not a writer's job to bring revolution. If by reading me, if you become a revolutionary or bring about a change, that's your business, but it's not my business to bring about revolution. So Agyey that way was not, he was kind of not aligned to any ideology. If anything, he was very close to radical humanists of M.N. Roy, and he said, I would like to be remembered as an anarchist, if at all that can be a ideological persuasion. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, the mic over there.
Thank you so much. So my name is Varsha, and I just wanted to ask about your research process, since we started with that, about how was the research process, how was it different researching for a biography vis-a-vis researching for any other text, and also once you don't find anything, like you said that you were looking for Kripa Sen and you couldn't find for 6 months. How is that process? Like when do you decide now I'm going to stop looking for it?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Yeah. And it's a lament of all writers, those who write non-fiction, especially this archival-based work. My ground rule is, when it comes to biographies or even non-fiction, try and be as factual as possible, footnote it. Don't say things out of your hat. And in this case, as I said right in the beginning, there were many gaps, which took me to Chicago, to Stanford, to New York, many places. There's archives where I could fill the gaps. Even National Archives, Delhi State Archives, where I could get papers about his revolutionary years. So that way damn easy, but few things. Not only Kripa Sen, I forgot to mention even Indumati. A fellow writer asked me the other day, what happened to Indumati? Where did she go? Why didn't you write? I want to know what happened to Indumati. Even I wanted to know, and I asked family members. They were the only source. And family doesn't want to talk about her. What do? I tried every possible. So I kind of made her invisible in the narrative. Similarly, Kripa Sen. And at some point you have to decide, see, she comes from a very influential family in Indore. Very, very influential family. I used all my contacts that I could use. My friends in bureaucracy, in Madhya Pradesh cadre, everyone I asked, can you just check whether... No one knows. There is this, she came from Wellinkar family. The Wellinkars are a big educational institute they run in Maharashtra and parts of Madhya Pradesh. They said, well, we have nothing to do with it. We don't know who this lady is. Someone else said they know, they're not telling you. I didn't want to... So at some point you have to just put an end to it and just write. So I had enough. At least her relationship with Agyey, I could see that it has all kind of ended sometime in the 60s when he visits Europe, meets her for the last time and writes a poem. So that's where it ends. So somewhere down you have to say, you have to end it. So that's how I do it.
I just have one supplementary question to a very excellent question, which is, you mentioned that you had done dozens of interviews, but at the end of the day, you hardly used any, because the information
I forgot to mention this. Yeah, that's a very interesting. I wanted to. Yeah. See, with Agyey, I did 60 interviews. people who are alive, they're very much alive, people who knew him, and people who claim to know him, people who claim to be very intimate with him. Now, I hit except for two people, and I kept mentioning them, 93-year-old that time, Krishna Sobti and Kuvan Narayan, the great Hindi poet. These two people were very factual, and you could make out, you could actually cross-check things that he said. They said with facts, you could get some documentation somewhere. Others were trying to fix Agyey even after his death. Someone was telling me that he has this, that illegitimate child in Allahabad. I know it, that guy is telling me. How the hell do I prove it? How, or why should it even be part of my biography? And he tells me a story, and I ask that so-called illegitimate child, I go and interview him too. And I asked him the same story, and his narrative completely changes it, because the first gentleman was giving me a wrong story. And I can tell you who the first gentleman was. He is now no longer here. Namwar Singh. He was a great Marxist critic. But he was still trying to fix him. So I abandoned, in a way, all the 60 interviews I did, because I was not very sure. Because people were still trying to fix him.
So Akshay, in that sense, the book has a lot of academic rigor, because whatever you couldn't substantiate through proven and academic sources, you left out.
Yeah, I let out.
You didn't go by hearsay.
Yeah, although I'm not averse to kind of interviews, if it's done. Like the book that I'm working on, again, I did interview with a whole bunch of these young socialist leaders of the 70s who worked with Jayaprakash Narayan.
Is working on
And I realized, again, I hit the same rock. If you talk to one socialist leader in Bihar, they'll say, I was the darling of Jayaprakash Narayan. If you go to the other guy, he says, oh, that guy is he's a liar, he meant nothing. It's not my job to settle that dispute, who was the darling of Jayaprakash Narayan, right? I'm writing on Jayaprakash Narayan, not his darlings, or many of them. So I kind of now abandoned even an interview for that, because everyone has a different story.
Yeah. Any other questions? Gosh, that's good. I think we've said everything. Yes, the book is available at the bookstore. I highly recommend it and urge you to buy it. And Akshay is here to sign the books and answer any other questions you may have. So please do go ahead. Thanks a lot, Akshay, for this lovely conversation.
Thank you so much, Akshay ji, for showcasing your biography at our festival. And thank you, Poonam ji, for being with us for 2 days and being a part of lovely sessions. Thank you so much. Would request you all to head out outside. We are going to begin the play.